Every empire loves to tell you its destiny was forged on the battlefield, that nations are born in smoke and gunfire and heroic charges and decisive victories. But in the case of Germany, that's only half the story. Long before Prussian soldiers marched at Königgrätz or Sedan, something far quieter was happening in Berlin. Men in uniforms and frock coats were fighting over numbers on paper, over columns of revenues, lines of expenditure, obscure clauses about who could approve which tax. It looked boring. It was anything but. Prussia did not just forge Germany with blood and iron. It forged Germany with budgets, and it learned exactly how to weaponize them. Most people think of a budget as a constraint, a limit, a reminder that you can't have everything. Prussia treated the budget as a battlefield where wars were prepared years before the first shot was fired. In the early 19th century, the German-speaking world was a patchwork of dozens of states, each with its own tariffs, tolls, and tax systems. To move goods from one end of this world to the other, you would be stopped, inspected, and taxed again and again. Trade crawled, revenue dribbled, and political power remained fragmented behind customs posts and petty dues. Prussia looked at this chaos and saw not a natural order, but an opportunity. In 1818, Prussia passed a new tariff law, sweeping away internal customs barriers inside its own territory and replacing them with a single external tariff line. Officially, this was about efficiency, simplifying trade, cutting administrative costs, encouraging commerce. That was the surface story. Beneath it ran a second, more strategic logic. By building a unified customs area within its borders, Prussia created a prototype, a model it could invite others to join. For the smaller German states struggling with inconsistent revenues and costly bureaucracies, the offer was tempting. Prussia could say, link your customs system with ours and you gain access to a much larger market, a share in a larger customs pool, and more predictable income. Refuse, and your trade will find itself hemmed in by Prussian frontiers and outcompeted by goods moving freely across Prussian lines. Over the next decades, that tactic hardened into a structure. The Zollverein, the German customs union, formally launched in the 1830s. On paper, it was a free trade zone among German states. In practice, it was Prussia's first great budgetary weapon. Customs revenues from a growing number of states began to flow into a system Prussia administered. That did three crucial things. First, it expanded Prussia's revenue base without a single annexation. As more territories joined, the customs pool swelled, giving Prussia more money to allocate and more leverage over how that money was distributed. Second, it put Prussian officials in charge of the accounting, and they gained detailed knowledge of trade flows, industrial strengths, and fiscal weaknesses across much of Germany. The ledgers themselves became maps of power and vulnerability. Third, it conditioned other German rulers to live inside rules they had not written. Long before there was a German national parliament, there was a Prussian-led customs council, deciding what everyone would pay on imported grain or iron. Nothing about this looked like conquest in the traditional sense. There were no troops occupying capitals, no treaties of surrender being signed at gunpoint. But economically, a subtle surrender was already underway. States that depended on the customs pool soon found that leaving it would mean a hit to their budgets they could not easily afford. Prussia hadn't conquered them. It had quietly enrolled them in its spreadsheet. And once you run the spreadsheet, you decide who gets starved and who gets fed. Customs and tariffs, however, were only one side of the story. To turn economic influence into political and military dominance, Prussia needed something else. An army not just proud of its history, but modern, mobile, and large enough to deal with whatever Europe threw at it. By the mid-19th century, the old Prussian army system was creaking. Rapid technological change, new doctrines, and the memory of humiliation at the hands of Napoleon all pointed in the same direction: reform or be left behind. Inside the Prussian state, a new kind of conflict emerged, not between Prussia and its neighbors, but between the king and his own parliament. In 1860, War Minister Albrecht von Roon presented a sweeping plan to reorganize the army. He wanted longer conscription terms, a larger standing force even in peacetime, and better funding for training, weapons, and logistics. All of this required a sharp increase in military spending. Prussia's liberal-dominated Landtag, its parliament, was not opposed to defending the country, but they feared the political implications of underwriting a giant permanent force loyal primarily to the crown. If they handed over the money without conditions, they risked creating an instrument that could tower over constitutional life itself. So the Landtag tried to use the one tool it had: the power of the purse. It insisted that any expansion of the army must be paired with political reforms, with clearer parliamentary control over the budget and the state. The king refused to compromise, and a standoff began. Year after year, the government sent its army budget to parliament, and year after year, the majority refused to approve it in full. For most modern states, a budget dispute is an inconvenience. For Prussia, whose identity and security were bound to its military, it was an existential deadlock. It was in the middle of this crisis that Otto von Bismarck stepped onto the stage as minister-president in 1862. Many remember him for one phrase: the declaration that the great questions of the age would not be decided by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron. The line is usually quoted as if it were a battle cry. But it matters where he said it, not on a battlefield, not in a royal proclamation, but in a budget commission. He was not just making a point about war. He was making a point about what the budget was for and who would control it. Bismarck's immediate problem was straightforward. He needed money for the army reforms, and Parliament would not give it to him. Rather than concede, he turned to a legal and constitutional argument already circulating among conservative jurists. According to this view, when the Constitution did not explicitly state what to do in a particular deadlock, when King and Parliament disagreed and the text fell silent, there was a gap in the law. In that gap, the monarchical principle filled the void. The king's authority could bridge the silence. This idea, later nicknamed the gap theory, was the perfect instrument for Bismarck's purposes. If there was a gap regarding what to do when a budget had not been passed, then the government could simply revert to the last approved budget as a formal basis, and in practice, collect and spend the funds it deemed necessary. In plain language, if Parliament refused to authorize the new budget, the government would pretend that was a technical irregularity and press ahead anyway. For 4 years, from 1862 to 1866, Prussia functioned without a constitutionally agreed budget. Taxes were collected, payments were made, and the army reforms advanced, all against the explicit will of the parliamentary majority. The budget, instead of being a negotiated reflection of society's priorities, became a blunt instrument of executive power. At home, this was Prussia's second weaponized budget, not a mechanism of integration like the Zollverein, but an internal battering ram used to smash through legislative resistance, while newspapers thundered and opposition leaders denounced what they saw as a coup against the constitutional government. Something else was happening quietly in the background. Each year of illegal budgets translated into new regiments, better equipment, more efficient mobilization plans, and new railway lines oriented toward rapid deployment. Prussia was turning contested tax revenue into a war machine. The budget crisis was not a distraction from foreign policy. It was the precondition for it. Then came the wars. Between 1864 and 1871, 3 major conflicts redrew Europe's map and turned Prussia from one power among many into the core of a new German empire. First, a conflict with Denmark over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Then, in 1866, a climactic struggle with Austria over leadership in the German-speaking world. Finally, in 1870-71, a showdown with France that electrified the continent. On the surface, these are military stories, full of maneuvers and battles. Behind them lies a fiscal story. The customs revenues from the Zollverein had broadened Prussia's tax base and enhanced its creditworthiness. Investors inside and outside Germany could see that Prussia was plugged into a growing, integrated economic area. That made it easier and cheaper for Prussia to borrow when needed. The years of disputed budgets had financed the very army reforms that now allowed Prussia to mobilize quickly, concentrate forces on key fronts, and strike decisively. And the rail lines, often planned with military utility in mind, turned Prussia's geography into an advantage rather than a vulnerability. None of this was accidental. It was the outcome of deliberate choices encoded in budgets years before the first gun was fired. The victory over Austria in 1866 did more than replace one diplomatic configuration with another. Militarily, Prussia shattered Austrian influence in German affairs. Politically, it dissolved the old loose German Confederation and replaced it with a North German Confederation under Prussian dominance. Financially and constitutionally, it handed Bismarck a powerful card in his fight at home. For years, liberals in the Landtag had accused him of violating the Constitution, of trampling the right of elected representatives to control taxation and spending. Now he could stand before them not as a lawbreaker, but as the architect of victory and unification. Bismarck moved quickly. He presented an indemnity bill asking Parliament to retroactively approve all the government's financial actions since the start of the budget crisis. In effect, he said, yes, the rules were bent or broken, but look at the outcome. Prussia is stronger. Germany is reorganized. Do you really want to invalidate the very policies that produced this? Many of his former opponents, faced with a wave of nationalist enthusiasm and the fear of being branded anti-unification, backed down. They voted to bless the spending they had once condemned. The illegal budgets became legal after the fact. This is one of the starkest examples of a state successfully weaponizing its budget. The government ignored the normal rules, funded its priorities anyway, used those funds to generate military and political success, and then used that success to rewrite the story of what had happened. The deeper lesson is unsettling. Once victory is on the table, the numbers in old ledgers are often treated as technicalities to be regularized. Success cleans the books. When France was defeated in 1871 and a new German emperor was proclaimed at Versailles, the long project of Prussian ambition seemed complete. The empire that emerged looked modern, industrial, and constitutional. It had a national parliament, the Reichstag, with the formal right to approve the imperial budget. It had a federal structure with multiple German states under one flag. But beneath the surface, the habits and assumptions of Prussia's earlier budget battles remained alive. Military spending, now on an imperial scale, was kept as insulated as possible from full democratic control. The army answered primarily to the emperor and his military command, not to the shifting majorities in the Reichstag. Long-term army funding was often arranged in multi-year blocks, reducing Parliament's ability to exert annual pressure. Strategic railways and fortifications were treated as matters of national security rather than normal policy, further distancing them from open fiscal debate. The same mindset that had justified ruling without a budget in the 1860s now lived on in subtler forms. Let the Parliament fight over social policy or school spending. The core instruments of power remained tied to a budgetary culture that placed them above ordinary negotiation. Seen from a distance, you can trace a clear line through all of this. Prussia discovered that budgets could do three kinds of work at once. Externally, they could be used to bind other states into economic dependence, as with the customs union. Internally, they could be bent to overpower a recalcitrant legislature in the name of higher goals. Strategically, they could be arranged in ways that produced outcomes so dramatic that any earlier constitutional doubts would be washed away. Each stage relied on the same underlying insight. The budget is not just a neutral record of income and spending. It is a tool of power. This raises a question that goes far beyond 19th century Europe. Why does any of this matter now? Because the structures and tactics that form Germany are not museum pieces. They are early chapters in a continuing story about how modern states quietly prepare the future through fiscal decisions the public barely notices. We still tend to treat budgets as technical documents, as tedious exercises in accounting. Yet every major project, every war, every large-scale transformation of a society must pass through the bottleneck of the budget. When governments talk about special funds, off-budget vehicles, temporary emergency measures, or extraordinary flexibility, or they are invoking the same basic logic. Sometimes the thing they want is too big, too controversial, or too deeply opposed to fit comfortably inside normal rules. Prussia's rulers did not pretend otherwise. They recognized that controlling the flow of money meant controlling the shape of reality. With the Zollverein, they turned tariff tables into instruments of influence, rewarding and punishing through revenue shares instead of military threats. With the budget crisis of the 1860s, they treated gaps in the Constitution as open doors through which they could carry their military program. With the Indemnity Bill after victory, they demonstrated that once the public has been given a story of national greatness, it will often retroactively bless the means that produced it. If you strip away the uniforms and archaic titles, the underlying pattern remains disturbingly familiar. Long before crises erupt on the surface, they are prefigured in what the budget allows and what it quietly forbids. Long before new political realities are celebrated, their foundations have been laid in obscure fiscal measures that only a handful of insiders truly understand. Prussia forged Germany not only by winning wars, but by mastering this hidden layer, by turning columns of numbers into artillery batteries, customs regulations into diplomatic leverage, and constitutional ambiguities into opportunities. So when you hear that a modern government has found a creative way to fund something outside the usual channels, or that a crucial program will be financed through one-time measures that will later be regularized, it may sound dry and technical. History suggests you should listen carefully. Behind the jargon, there may be a very old instinct at work, the instinct to weaponize the budget, to turn what looks like accounting into a quiet act of force. Germany did not simply march into existence. It was quietly penciled into existence first, in tariff laws, customs agreements, disputed army appropriations, and the willingness of rulers to bend the rules of finance in the name of destiny. By the time the flags were raised and the anthems sung, the real work had already been done on paper. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.